Hello everyone, and today I'm going to be discussing creating open-ended surveys using QuestionPro. QuestionPro basically is an online survey creation tool which allows you to create a variety of different kinds of surveys, both quantitative as well as qualitative, and has pretty extensive functionality in terms of the kinds of questions that you can ask. And so one of the reasons why you're sort of getting personalized training in this example is because QuestionPro unfortunately has not created training related to qualitative questions yet. And so some of the training that we've provided throughout the course from QuestionPro, unfortunately this is not available. So given that we want to make sure that you've got the tools necessary to complete this assignment, we thought this might be a great opportunity to sort of take you through some of the functions and features. That way, depending on what your research question is and the type of design that you want to use, you'll be able to sort of just pick up and hit the ground running using excuse me, QuestionPro for your course assignment. So anyways, I've already logged into QuestionPro, so one of the things that you'll have to do prior to gaining access is we've provided a link to log in with your university ID, which will allow you to access QuestionPro, create any number of surveys that you need to for research, your dissertation, master's thesis, whatever you're using it for. So anyways, so first we have to create a survey. So you'll locate there's a new survey button within your list of surveys that you may have already created if you've done so. If you haven't, the screen will pretty much be blank except for the button. And so you'll want to click on the new survey link button. What this will do is this will then ask you, what do you want to name your survey? So in this case, I'm going to call it qualitative assignment, if I can spell. And so now that I have entered in my name, I'm going to go ahead and hit create survey, and then this will take me to the survey page where I can start designing my survey. And so right off the bat, you'll have the option to begin adding a question. One option, of course, you can do is make them in Word and then import them. Although one of the things I have seen, so you want to be cognizant or mindful of this, is while this may seem easier given that most people know how to use Microsoft Word, and of course for any academic program you have to know how to use Microsoft Word. The downside, of course, to importing questions from Word is that sometimes you get these weird formatting glitches like fonts shift or font sizes shift, or even some of the formatting like font colors and things don't necessarily transition well between the platforms. So my recommendation is to actually just build the questions in QuestionPro directly, and then that way you're getting the quality of question that you're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and hit add question. What you'll see is you'll see a whole number of just different options that will appear on the left hand side in the add question box. And what it'll do is as you run your mouse over it, it will actually give you some different options, so you can kind of get an idea of the look and feel of what the question looks like. You also have an advanced option, although we really won't be using that for this course, but beyond the basic types of questions, you actually have additional advanced type questions that you can use as well, which allows you to essentially use those questions in a variety of different approaches. So let me click back over here to basic, and one of the things you may want to do prior to initiating your study is you might want to get some demographic information. So if you're interested in the gender differences of the types of questions that are being asked, if you're interested in particular like racial ethnicity differences, or even if you're interested in the kinds of roles of the people or the participants that you're going to be surveying, that might be helpful to actually create these kinds of questions. So just as an example, I'll first create a demographic question which has nominal variables. So for example, I'll have, what is your gender? Now, of course, there's the typical categories that we're pretty familiar with. However, one of the things I sometimes even suggest doing is adding a third option, so where you have other, and then someone can actually write in how they identify their gender. And of course, the nice thing about that is that recognizes the diversity of the different types of gender identities that are used, and also gives participants the ability to self-identify using the language that they use to describe themselves. So once I've, of course, created that question, I can rename the question number if I want to. In this case, I'll just leave it Q1. But, if I wanted this to say like demographic 1, demographic 2, the reason why this is helpful later is that if you name the questions, if you give them each question number a name so you know what it is, it makes it a lot easier to look at your data output later when you extract that data and begin analyzing it. So anyway, so this just gives you an example of using sort of nominal variables to create demographic questions so that you can look at some of the differences, in how people respond on the open-ended questions that we're about to create. So you have the option of sort of two approaches. One is you can ask very open-ended questions, which could essentially be, and I'm going to go ahead and click on, so I've hit add a question. I'm going to go ahead and click on the text option over here on the left, and I'm going to hit comment box, mainly because it gives us the ability to have multiple lines for participants to be able to express themselves. And so what it automatically will assume is that you're entering comments and a suggestion. So, one of the things the program will try to do is it'll try to predict exactly what the types of, the type of question you might ask. You'll notice a second ago when I was doing the gender question that it even tried to automatically assume when I put male, it knew the second question was likely going to be female. So it went ahead and entered that as well. But in this case, I'm going to override what this says, and I'm going to put a fairly open-ended question, which would be something like this. So tell me about your very open-ended question. Notice that I haven't written any language into the question that infers value or meaning. So like, for example, one way that I might have accidentally do this would be if I'm like, tell me about how satisfied you are with your work environment. Well, the problem with saying satisfied is that it assumes from the reader's perspective that they're super happy to be there, and you just want to know what about it they love. And it very well may be they hate their job, and it may be for reasons that are well beyond their control. So, in some cases you get employees, for example, that they don't, they actually, I'll just say it, they may be incompetent. And so, of course, they hate their job because they are experiencing the cognitive dissonance of both not really doing a good job, and at the same time the social pressure to do a good job. So unfortunately, what you want to do is you want to have these be, if you're creating an open-ended question, you want to try to have these as open-ended as possible without inferring any kind of meaning or assumption, so the participants themselves can actually express how they feel. You also have the ability to where you can even do additional follow-up questions to that. So, this might be where you could have a question like, where do you, or maybe something like this, like, what type of work do you do on a daily basis? And where? Maybe something like that. A little bit more of a structured question or semi-structured question. As a subsequent follow-up to the first, and sometimes too, I'll even see people sort of leave this part blank and then have as an extension of the previous. But that's an option if needed. If you want to force that the people have to respond to the question, you can hit the validation button down here, and they essentially get two options. One is force response, which says they have to answer the question to leave the survey. And then you have request response, which is if they skip this question, you're reminding them that they haven't answered it, but if they, for whatever reason, felt they couldn't answer the question, or felt offended by the question, which sometimes happens, they're not compelled to answer the question to complete the survey. So that's an option should you need it. I know in some cases especially when you get into surveys that have a little bit more advanced logic, and you have a research agenda of follow-up questions from a primary question, forced response is good, because then it ensures that as the person's answering questions, especially if you have subsequent questions, that if they answered yes to one or answered affirmatively to something, then that would give you the ability to ask follow-up questions for greater clarity. But again, if you didn't have a validation check and they skip the question, they're not going to get those subsequent questions. So just as an option. So anyway, so this is an example of creating an open-ended item. You also have the ability to go up to the settings, and you can it'll open a comment box feature list on the right-hand side. And you can actually set the limits on how many characters you want it to be. If you set it to 0, it means it's unlimited. You can also, tell it how large you want the text to be. So if you're going to have participants reading it who maybe have difficulty reading, by increasing the size, you have that option. And then you have some other features and fields as well. So if you wanted it to auto-populate some content here that they had to override, you have that ability as well. You'll notice that we also automatically had checked multiple rows of text, which what this does is this just allows them to write out multiple sentences related to the question that you've asked. And then, if you're asking questions like for their email address or something along those lines, you can create a text-filled question and then check email address. And what it does is if someone doesn't enter an email address, with a domain and an @ sign, it will spit it back to the participant saying that they haven't fully completed the item, which is great when you're trying to collect contact information. So anyway, so this gives an example of a semi-structured question. Now, if you wanted to have something that was a little bit more of or that was an open-ended question, my bad. This is a semi-structured question. So if you wanted to have something that says where you ask much more direct questions, but are still open-ended enough that they can sort of vary in terms of the response, you could then have something like, tell us about your experience with Mr. Johnson. We'll say that Mr. Johnson is their supervisor, right? What this does is that this more focuses the question. We know it's directly related to a supervisor, and we've called them by name so that exactly, especially if you're a person who has multiple supervisors, you know exactly which person that you're speaking to. And so this can give some insight into that person. Now, one thing you have to be somewhat cautious of when creating questions like this, though, particularly when they're referring to an individual or a particular role, is that some participants may be less inclined to answer this honestly, especially if they're only a team of like 2 or 3, where you could probably figure out very quickly which person that they are talking about. So that's certainly something to consider. So then we'll go ahead and add that, and then they will have the ability to respond. In some cases too, you'll even see where someone might have them after an open-ended question. They'll have a Likert-based question that might say, "Please rate Mr. Johnson on his friendliness," or "Please rate Mr. Johnson on his clarity of communication." So these kinds of aspects actually can be incredibly important. This kind of gives you an open or an explanation about how to create open-ended and semi-structured questions in QuestionPro. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask us. We're very glad to help. You can also do test runs of your survey, which we highly recommend to make sure that the survey is operating the way you expect it to, as well as, and this is very important, that when you actually go to pull your data, which you would do under analytics, you pull the data out and you understand exactly how the data is being extracted. So we hope you found this quick tutorial useful. And again, if you have questions, feel free to contact